Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. It's been a while since I've been back, but just had stuff to do over the past 3 or 4 weeks. So back though, ready to keep moving. And we're still working through this chapter on Sartre, interrogation and dialectic. This video will be the last video on the subsection perceptual faith and negativity. And the next video will be the first and the last video for the subsection after this, perceptual faith and interrogation, and that will be the end of this chapter, interrogation and dialectic. So I've broken this video up into 2 parts, the philosophy of negativity and dialectic. And in the first part, we're just going to just revisit Sartre's philosophy of negativity, just some general comments about that before we move into dialectic, and then that's going to be us for today. So the first section is the philosophy of negativity. So picking up from where I kind of left it off in the last video, the way that Merleau-Ponty acknowledges Sartre's contribution even as he criticizes Sartre's philosophy. We said there that I said in the last video Sartre was right, but only insofar as he understood being abstractly. But he was still correct in his analysis, particularly in his concrete phenomenological analysis of the human condition. And so the way I've understood this is that Merleau-Ponty is recognizing Sartre's phenomenological contribution, even as he's recognizing the ontological shortcomings. And so Merleau-Ponty's task in this book is ontological rather than phenomenological, and that's why there is this disconnect, I guess, between the two. In particular, the philosophy of the negative described our factual situation with more penetration than had ever before been done, and yet one retains the impression that this situation is one that is being surveyed from above, and indeed it is. The more one describes experience as a compound of being and nothingness, the more their absolute distinction is confirmed. The more the thought adheres to experience, the more it keeps it at a distance. And that's really exactly what I was saying. It's hard to beat Sartre for concrete descriptions of lived experience, what it is to be a human being, all those rich phenomenological descriptions he gave, bad faith, the look, that ambiguity of the for itself. Remember, I am what I am not, and I'm not what I am. All of those kinds of insights were so well captured by Sartre. However, ontologically, this is still very abstract. It's a cleavage into 2 realms, not like Descartes' metaphysics, for sure, but it's still a division that, while accurate as an abstract analysis and revealing as from a phenomenological viewpoint, it misses the world that Merleau-Ponty is looking for here, that invisible framework for the visible, on which the visible plays out. And this is essentially why Sartre's totality, that in itself, for itself, is an impossibility. It's a myth for the for itself, precisely because he starts with the abstraction. So instead of having the whole in view from the beginning, he begins with this abstract position of being versus nothingness. And once you start with that, putting them together is always going to be impossible. It's always going to yield a kind of Frankenstein's monster, which in this case means that it's something which can never be realized. an impossible dream. And approaching ontology, if you like, in this kind of backwards fashion, starting with the abstract rather than starting with the whole, means that one of those abstractions, the nothingness for Sartre, always remains a residue, something left over, a remainder that can never be incorporated again into the whole. And that's exactly what Sartre did come up against, did find. So that's the ontological weakness, I guess, that Merleau-Ponty's picking out in Sartre's philosophy, even as he's recognizing the penetration that Sartre achieved in describing our factual situation. Another quote, which I'll just briefly throw up as well, which kind of covers the same territory, but is a nice quote. The formula being is not, is an idealization, an approximation of the total situation, which involves, beyond what we say, the mute experience from which we draw what we say. So this is kind of the same point, that being and nothingness is an abstract idealization. But I wanted to point that out. I wanted to bring that quote up because of that expression, mute experience. So to say that being is and nothingness is not, that's an idealization. It's an approximation of the total situation. And that total situation is beyond what we say, beyond what we can say, the mute experience from which we draw what we say, from which we our experience, or upon which our experience can take place, out of which we can live. And that expression, mute experience, is important, and we're going to revisit it a little bit later on. But the idea basically is that, and we've talked about this a couple of videos prior as well, in saying what the situation is, we've already said too much, because the ground, the world being the ground of our experience, is silent. And as soon as you formalize it, as soon as you formulate it into expressions, semi-concrete, semi-tangible concepts, you lose it. And that's exactly what Merleau-Ponty is saying about being and nothingness. As soon as you make that division, anything any reasoning that follows from that is going to be moving in the wrong direction. It's not so much that being and nothingness is a bad way to understand human experience. It's a good way. It gives us a lot of insights. As Merleau-Ponty said, it described our factual situation with more penetration than had ever been done before. But it misses that original, that origin, that source from which this factual situation can emerge. And it's that he's interested in, and it's that which is silent, mute. And that's the challenge. And again, this is repeating something we said a few videos back, I think in the reflection section, about the way that our expressions fail us. We can't convert this being, the foundation of experience, into concepts, into terms. And so we have to find a way around that. And this is where Merleau-Ponty wants to go here. He wants to discover or rediscover the common milieu where being and nothingness are only lecta, labouring against each other. Our point of departure shall not be being is, nothingness is not, nor even there is only being, which are formulas of a totalizing thought, a high-altitude thought. But there is being, there is a world, there is something. And that really captures Merleau-Ponty's goal here. It's not enough to say, it's not enough to discount being is and nothingness is not, but he also wants to get rid of there is only being, because thinking of it in those terms means that we've captured everything. It's a complete and finished philosophy. It's a concept. It's a complete thought, and that's what Merleau-Ponty is saying, that this can never be. Being can never be this kind of thing. It's all we can say is there is being. There is a world. There is something. We can't totalize it. So, and there's a real flavor of Levinas in this, right? He had the same kind of idea against this idea of a totality, of bringing things into a relation such that we could totalize them, such that they would fit into a concept, some kind of structure and order. And Merleau-Ponty's really following on with that same vein of thought. And this goes back to his idea of perceptual faith, right? There is being. There is a world. That's all we can say. We can't say there's only being and this is it. We've captured it. We've got it in this concept, in this philosophy, in this structure. We can't say that. All we can say, all we're entitled to say is there is being. So that's interesting. Very much, like I say, very reminiscent of Levinas. Also very reminiscent of Derrida, strangely enough. Strange to bring in Derrida in a video on Merleau-Ponty, I would have thought, but as I'm reading this, I'm reading Derrida at the same time, and the parallels are quite striking. I want to talk more about this a little bit later, but let me just note that at this point as well. So Merleau-Ponty goes on to say that this also answers the question of why there is something rather than nothing. And it's not because nothingness inexists, which is kind of a semantic resolution, if you like. And that was what we talked about earlier with the way that Sartre's philosophy of negativity resolves the question, but it resolves it, like I say, in kind of a semantic, through a semantic loophole, if you like. But it resolves it because one does not arouse being from nothingness ex nihilo. One starts with an ontological relief where one can never say that the ground be nothing. What is primary is not the full and positive being upon a ground of nothingness. It is a field of appearances, each of which, taken separately, will perhaps subsequently break up or be crossed out. This is the part of nothingness, but of which I only know that it will be replaced by another, which will be the truth of the first. Because there is a world, because there is something. A world, a something, which in order to be, do not first have to nullify the nothing. So this is the faith of perceptual faith. There's always something. One starts with an ontological relief. To go the other way, to think that there is something must arise from nothing, nothing must be prior, something in order for something to be, it must have come to be in the first place, which means that nothing must have preceded it. This is kind of the scientific or a logical way of thinking. That makes sense, right? It makes sense to say that. If something exists, it must have come into existence at some point. It's a perfectly logical, sensible, rational belief to hold. But that's the problem. Those sensible, logical, rational ways of thinking apply only within the world. When you apply them to the world itself, in this case, the world as an ontological ground of our experience, you end up with with nonsense. It looks wrong. It sounds wrong. It sounds impossible. But that's exactly what Merleau-Ponty's point is. That's why this is what he's talking about. The ground that he's talking about is a mute experience. It's silent. It transcends our concepts and our words. It's what I've called this, and I think I called it this in the Bergson series, parts-based thinking about the world in terms of parts, and that's perfect, and it's exactly what we want to do in the world. It's why science is so successful. All of our concepts and logic, it's all based on that way of thinking. But you can't take that same thinking and apply it to the ground out of which that thinking can arise. If you do, it just doesn't work anymore. It doesn't make sense. And that's the paradox. That's why there is this paradox. Why is there something rather than nothing? It's only a paradox if you limit yourself to that scientific, logical, rational way of thinking. And this isn't to say, I always have to say this isn't to say that, okay, if we're going to get rid of logic and science and reason, well, the floodgates are open, anything goes. Now we can talk about extra dimensions and astral traveling and universal mind or God or whatever. Mysticism, now the floodgates are wide open. Absolutely not. There's nothing in this which suggests that, which has some kind of religious direction to it. There's nothing in this which has any mystical overtones. To acknowledge that there's a limit to the thinking that is logical or rational or scientific is not to then endorse mysticism or religion or the supernatural or anything like that. It's just acknowledging that there is a limit. And we are at that limit when we try and think this ontological ground, the world that Merleau-Ponty is talking about here. But we don't want to go the other direction and then endorse something just as inadequate, just on the other side. We don't want to endorse some kind of mystical being. We don't want to endorse magical properties, mysticism, meditation, accessing higher states of mind or whatever. We don't need to go to that opposite. We can just remain in the middle here, acknowledging that we can't, our concepts are inadequate for this, to capture the mute experience of this ontological grounding without turning it into one or the other. And that's the thing. It's the same. The religious or mystical era is the same mistake as the rational, logical era, just in the other direction. They're both crystallizing what is something which is uncrystallizable. They're both turning into concepts and terms something which is fundamentally inexpressible, because no religion would survive if it actually didn't say anything, if it actually maintained silence about the origins, right? About the nature of God, for example. And so that's where we are. We're at that point where parts-based thinking doesn't work. And so this paradox, why is there something rather than nothing, once we shed that illusion that parts-based thinking is the way forward and must apply to the whole, although Merleau-Ponty wouldn't use that word, that's a maybe metaphysical distinction that Bergson makes, but if we apply that to this ontological ground that is the world, then this paradox dissolves. We no longer have to explain why there's something rather than nothing, because we've reached the limit of explanation. All we can say is there is something. There is no need to explain how something arises from nothing. That would be incumbent upon you if we were talking about something within the world. When it comes to the world itself, that problem no longer needs an answer. It's no longer a problem. It's a false problem. And we've talked about this before too, right? I think in the first or second video, every appearance is replaced by another appearance, which will be the truth of the first, because there is no ultimate end to this. This is where it starts. There is a world, there is something. That's where our inquiries begin. And now we can focus on understanding something about that world. It's not going to be easy because we've already seen that our concepts are inadequate. Words fail us, literally. But that's the task before us. So there's an interesting section next where Merleau-Ponty talks about openness upon being. And he says that reflection and negativity both make the same mistake, and this mistake renders an openness upon being impossible. So reflection did this. It meant that there was no openness upon being because it locked itself in concepts, identifying itself with its thoughts, reducing the world, as we saw, to noema. In other words, it failed to provide any distance between the reflecting and the unreflected. So we were no longer in the world was in us. We were constituting the world. And without that distance, we can't talk of any kind of openness upon being. There's no space, there's no room for any kind of openness upon being. We've collapsed it down into this constituting subject. And negativity does the same thing. It also obviates this distance by rendering the subject, which is nothing, identical with the naive perceiver, and the naive perceiver then with what is perceived. So again, without any space for an encounter, there cannot be any openness upon being. So they both close off any kind of access to being, any chance for a genuine engagement with this ontology that Merleau-Ponty is talking about. And that brings us to the second part of the video, dialectic. All right, so this section is kind of interesting. And we start by kind of breaking up dialectics into two. The division's not made explicitly, I don't think, in the book, but there are two aspects, if you like, of dialectical thought. There's the historical one and the more individual. So historically, Merleau-Ponty says dialectical thought progresses in stages, but stages in which former stages, rather than disappearing, are incorporated into present stages, being retroactively modified by them. So we have here a thought that itself traces its own course, that finds itself by advancing. So this is kind of a nice idea. It has an aspect of dynamism to it. It has a kind of directionality, but without a teleology. So we have movement, we have progression, and we have a situation where there's no thing progressing. The thing is the progression. And that's the next point. The thinker, him or herself, is never an outside witness nor a pure agent. Rather, he who speaks and that which he understands tacitly always co-determines the meaning of what he says. The philosopher is always implicated in the problems he poses, and there is no truth if one does not take into account in the appraising of every statement the presence of the philosopher who makes the statement. So there's no viewing of this spectacle from above. There's no detachment from the spectacle. The thinker is incorporated into the very fabric of this situation. And then there's a kind of an individual aspect to dialectical thought as well. And here, dialectical thought thinks either the in itself or the for itself only by proceeding toward its opposite. That for which the circular movement is neither the simple sum of the opposed movements nor a third movement added to them, but their common meaning, Merleau-Ponty says. The two component movements, visible as one sole movement, having become a totality. And that's kind of, it has that same sense that we saw with the historical aspect. There's inherent dynamism here. There's an inherent movement within this way of thinking, this dialectical thought. There is never just the for itself or the in itself, and anytime you focus on one, you get kind of pushed to the other. And so there's this never-ending circular movement here. And what's the truth of this, if you like, is in their common meaning rather than two component movements that can be understood separately. They always come together in this whole, but again, a whole that has this dynamism intrinsically captured within it. And in fact, Merleau-Ponty says, is this not exactly what we're looking for? And he says, yes, in a sense it is. However, in the history of philosophy, dialectics has never been just this. And the reason is that dialectics is intrinsically unstable. It has never been able to formulate itself into theses without denaturing itself. And because if one wishes to maintain its spirit, it is perhaps necessary to not even name it. The sort of being to which it refers and which we have been trying to indicate is in fact not susceptible of being designated positively. It abounds in the sensible world, but on condition that the sensible world has been divested of all that the ontologies have added to it. The very formulas by which it describes the movement of being are then liable to falsify that movement. So a couple of ideas from that. The first, the being that Merleau-Ponty's after here cannot be designated positively. It can't, we've talked about the way it can't be expressed. We've talked about it as a mute experience. And now we're adding this other idea, it can't be designated positively. It's everywhere in the sensible or the visible world, but only as a kind of, and this is how I think of it, a kind of structure or framework, which is the invisible. It's the sensible, stripped of all that the ontologies have added to it, stripped of all that our theories of being have attempted to put into it. Once you strip all of that out, that's what the invisible framework is, what you're left with. And that's what Merleau-Ponty's after here. That framework which can't be described positively, because in order for anything to be described, in order for anything to be able to be described positively, it requires that invisible framework already. And that's the key. As soon as you can describe it, as soon as you can articulate it positively, you needed that invisible foundation to do that. And so you've already missed the thing you were looking for. And that's really the goal here, how to peel back the layers of, I guess it is kind of peeling back the layers of the world, the sensible world, to uncover the framework, the structures that allow that sensible world to exist in the first place. And like I said before, any of the way that we think, even the terms that we use, the concepts that we've developed, logic, reason, all of those things apply to that sensible world, to that visible world, and they don't apply when you get to the grounding for them, to the foundation. They can't apply because in order for them to exist, in order for them to be articulated, you need that original layer. And it's that layer that the Merleau-Ponty is looking for. So dialectics, in trying to formulate the world in positive terms, albeit terms that require other terms and that describe a kind of continual circular movement, falsifies it. It immediately gives you something. The thing you were looking for has now been passed. You've missed it. You've already overstepped. And the instability, the reason that dialectics is intrinsically unstable, is because as soon as it crystallizes its ideas into formulas, they no longer describe what they were originally designed to do. The dialectic, Merleau-Ponty says, is by principle and epithet. As soon as one takes it as a motto, speaks of it instead of practicing it, it becomes a power of being, an explicative principle. As soon as one utters the dialectic, it becomes a power of being, a part of being. It becomes wrapped up in the world rather than giving us access to the world as that foundation, as that ontological being that Merleau-Ponty is looking for. So he discusses Hegel and Sartre as well here, because obviously Hegel is the king of dialectics, and Sartre's negativity has a dialectical element to it. It is essentially a form of dialectics as well. So both of these thinkers fit into this category nicely. Hegel, Merleau-Ponty says, with Hegel we have God defined as abyss or absolute subjectivity, negates himself in order that the world might be. So God essentially makes himself man. And in Sartre, the for itself as negation sacrifices itself, negating itself, giving rise to the positive plenitude of being. And both of these movements are the same. They're a negation of negation that yields positivity. The same metamorphosis of the dialectic, the same relapse into ambivalence occurs in both cases, and for the same reason, because the thought ceases to accompany or to be the dialectical movement, converts it into signification, thesis, or thing said, and thereby falls back into the ambivalent image of the nothingness that sacrifices itself in order that being be, and of the being that, from the depths of its primacy, tolerates being recognized by the nothingness. So the problem is that thought converts the movement, that dialectical movement. It doesn't stay with it, it doesn't retain it, it doesn't investigate that, it converts it into signification, theses, or things said, and then has to cash everything out in those terms, or tries to cash everything out in those terms. And so it's like kind of being, and I think I've used this analogy before, it's looking too closely at the thing. You look too closely and you find these parts, and then you take those parts to be intrinsic. And when you try and understand the working of the whole through those parts, you end up missing the thing that you're looking for. You no longer grasp the whole itself. Instead, you grasp the working of the parts. And that's useful and interesting, and both Sartre and Hegel's philosophies are interesting and useful, but they miss this ontological grounding that Merleau-Ponty's interested in. And so with that, Merleau-Ponty says that there is good dialectic and bad dialectic. The bad dialectic is that which thinks it recomposes being by aesthetic thought, by an assemblage of statements, by thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And the good dialectic, which he also calls hyperdialectic, and remember, we talked, Merleau-Ponty's used that hyper prefix before when he talked about reflection and the good kind of reflection he called hyper-reflection. Here, the good kind of dialectic is the hyperdialectic, and it's that which is conscious of the fact that every thesis is an idealization, that being is not made up of idealizations or of things said, as the old logic believed, but of bound wholes, where signification never is except in tendency, where the inertia of the content never permits the defining of one term as positive, another term as negative, and still less a third term as absolute suppression of the negative by itself. So the way dialectics is positive for Merleau-Ponty, but the way it's been adopted, the way it's been used in the history of philosophy, has been in this negative form. It's if you like, it's analyzed too closely, and it's mistaken the parts for the whole. And that's pretty much where I want to wrap up this video. But before I do, I just wanted to revisit that point I mentioned earlier about the overlaps with Derrida, of all people. I never imagined I would have anything interesting to say about Derrida, but actually reading him, I'm finding him quite interesting. His philosophy is very different from what I expected it to be, and I'm reading the collection of essays published in 1967 called Writing Indifference. And man, there is the parallels between that, the essays in there, and this work of Merleau-Ponty's is crazy. It's unbelievable. And even more so because Derrida doesn't mention Merleau-Ponty at all. I don't know if he was aware of this, or maybe he just didn't care about Merleau-Ponty. Maybe he wrote him off as a phenomenologist and didn't pay any attention to this material anyway. But certainly in Merleau-Ponty's later phase, and the Prose of the World, I think, does move in this direction as well, which was a project that Merleau-Ponty abandoned, and the more I'm thinking about this now, the more I believe that he abandoned it because he was trying to bring everything together into a totality. The Prose of the World was the first part of a planned two-part series. The second part was called The Origin of Truth. And I think the way that The Visible and the Invisible is going, I think he came to the belief that there's no such thing as this ultimate truth. That was that's kind of what he's been saying here. This being is something which is not amenable to a kind of capital T truth. There is no way to encapsulate being in any kind of fashion, in any kind of positive form. And so I think, perhaps, and this is just my opinion, that might have been why he abandoned the prose of the world. And it's where he's going with the visible and the invisible, and that would make sense that this would connect with Derrida, who, of course, is all about there being no final truth, no meaning, no sense. That's kind of his thing. And like I say, the parallels are crazy. I'll just go through some of them that I've pointed out, that I've picked up. Mute experience, we talked about that in here. In Derrida, he talks about silence as the ground of expression. Merleau-Ponty, abstract objects labouring against each other. That was the lector, actually. I didn't mention that, but that was in that quote. He talks about being and nothingness are lector, labouring against each other. And that lector means abstract objects, but the overlap with Derrida is that word labouring against each other. Derrida talks about a lot about work and economy in this same vein, as kind of having fallen away from any origin, the source, having moved away from what is. It's hard to put these things into words, because anything I say will be contradicted by Derrida, but to moving away from the small t truth of the situation. Let me say that. As soon as he talks about work and economy, he's talking about something which a kind of a localized epoch, maybe, is what he would say, a part of an isolated part of a wider being. But that wider being, to use Merleau-Ponty's word, is something that is beyond this work and economy. Work and economy signifies that you've moved into a kind of localized, abstract part. And it was just interesting to see that word labouring come up in Merleau-Ponty, very reminiscent of work in Derrida. Openness on being, arising from the space of the encounter, the key word being space. In Derrida, spacing is a non-geometrical periodicity or discontinuity, which allows life, which allows experience. Just another kind of connecting point. The inability of speech or positivity to capture being. In Derrida, it's exactly the same, especially with traditional concepts. We must, Derrida says, displace them. We must reinterpret them so as to reveal the play of difference. Same kind of thing worked through in Derrida. And the rejection of this negative and the positive in Merleau-Ponty, that dialectical play. Derrida says exactly the same thing, except not just negative and positive. He wants to go beyond all of these, what he calls metaphysical opposites, meaning and non-meaning, negative and positive, being and becoming. All of those pairings arise only within an abstraction of the whole. And so there is no route to an understanding of the whole through these kinds of pairings. And so I just thought it was interesting to see that and to bring that to your attention, because if you're watching this video, you probably like Merleau-Ponty, which means you probably don't like Derrida. At least that was kind of that's been my experience, my case. But having actually read Derrida, I now have a very different opinion of him, and it was just really, really interesting to see the connections, and doubly so because Derrida doesn't mention Merleau-Ponty at all. Maybe he didn't know of any of this material. I don't know. Maybe he wrote Merleau-Ponty off as a phenomenologist. Maybe he thought he dealt with him in dealing with Husserl, because he does talk about Husserl quite a bit. But either way, it was interesting to see that. So let's have a look at a summary. So first up, we talked about the philosophy of negativity. We looked at the good, which I called the phenomenology of Sartre, and the bad, which I called the ontology of Sartre. So phenomenologically speaking, Sartre is incisive, insightful, penetrating in his thought. He describes our factual situation in a way that has never been described before. But his ontology suffers because he gets caught up in these opposites, being and nothingness. So being is, nothingness is not. That is an idealization. It's abstract, and it crystallizes what are abstract parts of this broader whole. It crystallizes them into something into things which seem more important than they are. So everything then becomes cashed out in these terms of being and nothingness when we've forgotten, we've lost sight of the fact that they are only abstract parts of this whole. Being, world, or situation, whatever word you want to use to describe this, the foundation that Merleau-Ponty's looking to capture is mute or silent. There was a key realization here. And finally, there was no openness upon being in negativity. And the reason for this is there's no distance between nothingness and being. Nothingness as nothingness is not anything in itself, so it as Merleau-Ponty says, sacrifices itself in order that being be. But this means that there's then no space for an encounter. We can't talk about an encounter because there is only being, just revealing itself through this nothingness. The second part of the video was dialectic, and we looked at the historical and the individual aspects of dialectical thought. The first one progressing in stages. The second one, that circular movement, which is the common meaning of the two terms. So you're always directed to the opposite term anytime you want to focus on one. And there's this kind of internal dynamism that's generated there, and a kind of ambivalence as well. The problem is that the dialectic is unstable. It always crystallizes into positive terms which are therefore unable to express the world. As soon as they become formalized into signification, thesis, or things said, they lose the capacity to describe, to express the world, to grasp the world in any way. And we looked at Hegel and Sartre in particular, and both of these philosophers end up converting that dialectical movement into signification, missing this framework, this invisible framework that Merleau-Ponty is looking to articulate in some way. And this ended up with Merleau-Ponty identifying a good and a bad dialectic. The good is that which is conscious of the fact that every thesis is an idealization. Merleau-Ponty called this a hyper-dialectic. and the bad is that which tries to think or say being in traditional terms, in terms of logic, meaning, positivity, reason, all of those traditional methods. And that is us for today. Interesting. Kind of moving in a direction that I didn't really expect this to go, but more interesting for that fact. And I don't know if I would have picked up on it as much of this as I have if I hadn't been reading Derrida, as things that have really slotted into place in a way that not sure they would have otherwise. But I think the visible and the invisible is making a little bit more sense to me now, the second time through making these videos, and with Derrida kind of whispering in my head as we go. Anyway, thanks for watching. Hopefully this helped, and I'll see you next time.